November 12, 1970, an 8-ton problem washed ashore on Florence, Oregon's pristine coastline. And what happened next would become the most spectacular failure in municipal problem-solving history. A 45-foot sperm whale, deceased for days, presented local authorities with a decomposing dilemma that would ultimately attract global attention for all the wrong reasons. The solution they chose, burying the creature under a half-ton of dynamite, seemed logical to exactly one person: George Thornton, the Oregon Highway Division engineer who would inadvertently orchestrate one of history's most documented disasters. What started as a local curiosity became a cautionary tale that transcended decades, resurrected by the internet to teach new generations about the spectacular intersection of good intentions and catastrophic execution. This is the story of how 20 cases of dynamite, one dead whale, and the confident assumption that the ocean will take care of the rest created a legend that refuses to die, much unlike the whale that started it all. The first call came into the Oregon State Highway Division office at 8:47 a.m. on November 9, 1970, and the dispatcher thought it was a prank. A massive sperm whale had beached itself 2 miles south of Florence, Oregon, on a stretch of sand locals called South Beach. Not a living whale in distress. Those called for marine rescue protocols and veterinary intervention. This was something far more problematic. A 45-foot-long, 8-ton cetacean that had been dead for an estimated 3 to 4 days before the tide deposited it beyond the high water mark. The November air, typically crisp with ocean salt and pine, now carried something else entirely: the unmistakable stench of decomposition on a scale few could imagine. By midday, the whale had drawn a crowd. Curiosity seekers drove from as far as Eugene, 50 miles inland, to witness the Leviathan up close. Children dared each other to approach, handkerchiefs pressed against their faces. Photographers documented every angle. The carcass lay partially on its side, its massive bulk creating a shadow across the sand, skin already showing signs of bloating as internal gases built up in the sealed cavity of its body. The eye, clouded and vacant, stared toward the dunes as if searching for an escape that would never come. The Oregon State Highway Division, rather than the Parks Department or Fish and Wildlife, inherited this biological time bomb due to a quirk of jurisdiction. The whale had landed on a beach that fell under highway maintenance territory, technically part of the coastal road corridor. District Engineer George Thornton received the assignment with the weight of bureaucratic inevitability: solve this problem, make it disappear, and do it before the holiday weekend brought more tourists to witness and smell the disaster. Initial assessments revealed the scope of the challenge. Marine biologists estimated the whale had been dead before beaching, likely from natural causes related to age or illness. No visible injuries suggested boat strikes or fishing net entanglement. The creature had simply reached the end of its journey and had the misfortune of doing so in a location where its death became someone else's emergency. The body weight, conservatively estimated at 16,000 pounds, made simple removal impossible without heavy industrial equipment. Even if cranes could lift it, where would it go? Who would accept an 8-ton decomposing whale carcass? And could any truck support that weight without its axles snapping? Thornton consulted with local experts, all of whom offered solutions, none of which seemed practical. Burial meant digging a hole the size of a school bus, deep enough that scavengers wouldn't excavate it and tide cycles wouldn't expose it. Towing it back to sea required equipment the Highway Division didn't possess, and carried the risk of the carcass simply washing up again on someone else's beach, their problem becoming another jurisdiction's crisis. Rendering plants, facilities that processed animal remains into usable products, refused citing the logistical nightmare and the reality that decomposed whale tissue had zero commercial value. The numbers told a story of escalating absurdity: 45 feet of length, 8 tons of weight, 72 hours of decomposition, temperatures hovering at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to accelerate decay, but not cold enough to preserve. The nearest rendering facility sat 127 miles inland. Estimated burial depth required 20 feet. Projected cost for conventional removal: $12,000. Equivalent to $92,000 in 2024. Number of phone calls to Thornton's office in the first 48 hours, 47. Number of viable solutions proposed, 0. As the week progressed, the whale's condition deteriorated. Gases inflated the carcass to grotesque proportions, stretching the skin taut like a biological balloon filled with the foulest contents imaginable. Marine biologists warned of potential rupture, a spontaneous explosion of putrefied tissue that could occur without warning. The clock was ticking, the pressure building, and George Thornton was about to make the decision that would define his entire career and inadvertently create an enduring legend of municipal misadventure. The stage was set. The whale waited. And somewhere in Thornton's mind, an idea was forming. One that involved lots of explosives and a fundamental misunderstanding of physics. Florence, Oregon, in 1970 wasn't prepared for international attention, and it certainly wasn't equipped to handle an 8-ton biological crisis that wouldn't stop growing. The town, population 2,100, existed in that comfortable Pacific Northwest space between fishing village and tourist destination. Highway 101 brought summer visitors seeking coastal beauty and winter storms. Local economy depended on fishing, logging, and the steady trickle of travelers who stopped for gas, lunch, and photographs of the dramatic seascape. The Chamber of Commerce promoted Florence as quiet, unspoiled, and pristine, adjectives now thoroughly compromised by the massive, malodorous mammal dominating South Beach. Business owners along Bay Street noticed the impact within 48 hours. Restaurant reservations canceled. Hotel guests checked out early, citing unforeseen circumstances that everyone understood as olfactory assault. The wind, typically a blessing that brought fresh ocean air, became a curse when it shifted southeast, carrying whale stench directly into town. Shopkeepers burned incense, set out potpourri, and apologized to customers who entered their establishments asking, "What died?" The answer, unfortunately, was both literal and impossible to ignore. Mayor Robert Harms faced pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Business interests wanted immediate action: removal, burial, disposal, anything to eliminate the tourist-deterring problem before Thanksgiving weekend. Environmental groups, nascent but vocal in 1970, questioned whether explosives or chemicals might damage the beach ecosystem. State officials wanted documentation, permits, and liability waivers. The Oregon Highway Division wanted someone else to make the decision. But history had precedents, and George Thornton had done his homework. He discovered that beach towns worldwide had faced similar cetacean corpse crises, and solutions varied wildly in effectiveness and spectacle. In 1955, a dead whale in South Africa had been towed out to sea, only to wash back ashore 3 weeks later in even worse condition. In 1968, a Danish community had attempted to bury a whale, creating what locals called the beach that reeked for a decade as decomposition gases percolated through sand. Chemical dissolution had been tried in Australia, with results described in official reports as unsuccessful and inadvisable. The most intriguing precedent came from military ordnance disposal. During World War II and the Korean conflict, Beaches had occasionally required clearing of unexploded munitions, dead sea creatures, or debris from naval engagements. The solution? Controlled explosives. The theory held that a sufficiently powerful detonation would obliterate the problematic object, scattering remains small enough for natural scavengers, seagulls, crabs, microorganisms, to consume or for tides to disperse. It was elegant in its simplicity. Let nature clean up the mess, you just had to make the mess small enough for nature to handle. Thornton pitched this solution at a town meeting on November 11th, presenting it with the confidence of someone who had consulted with experts, reviewed historical cases, and convinced himself that this was the logical solution. The whale will be disintegrated into pieces small enough for scavengers to clean up, he explained to a room of skeptical but desperate citizens. The ocean will do the rest. He cited the military precedent, the impracticality of alternatives, and the urgency of the situation. No one in that room had better expertise. No one had alternative solutions that seemed more viable. The decision, by default and desperation, moved forward. What Thornton didn't mention, perhaps because he didn't fully grasp it, was that military ordnance disposal occurred on beaches that had been evacuated and secured. The objects being destroyed were metal and concrete, not tissue and bone. The goal was fragmentation for safety, not obliteration for disposal. The physics were fundamentally different. A bomb casing shatters into predictable shrapnel patterns. A whale filled with gases and fluids behaves like a biological pressure vessel with no structural integrity and infinite potential for chaos. The consultation phase lasted 72 hours. Number of experts contacted, 11. Number who recommended explosives, 1. Thornton himself. Number who recommended burial, 4. Number who recommended towing to sea, 3. Number who recommended do nothing and let nature take its course, 3. Cost estimates ranged from $2,000, burial, to $18,000, professional removal. Thornton's dynamite plan, estimated $500 in explosives. Amount of dynamite military typically used for beach ordnance, 5 to 50 pounds. Amount Thornton would ultimately use, 1,000 pounds. The decision to use explosives wasn't made in a moment of madness. It emerged from a series of rational calculations that each made sense independently, but combined into spectacular miscalculation. George Thornton's engineering background gave him confidence in controlled demolition principles. He'd overseen highway construction projects involving rock blasting, bridge demolitions, and hillside excavations where precisely calculated explosive charges reshaped landscapes according to plan. The mathematics of blast force, material resistance, and fragmentation patterns were familiar territory. The problem, as would become horrifyingly clear, was that organic tissue doesn't follow the same rules as granite, concrete, or steel. The planning phase revealed Thornton's fundamental assumption that a whale carcass would behave like an oversized, exceptionally smelly boulder. If you wanted to break up a large rock, you calculated its volume, estimated its density, and applied enough explosive force to overcome structural integrity. The fragments would scatter in a predictable cone pattern, with larger pieces traveling shorter distances and smaller debris radiating outward. Gravity and mass would govern the ballistics. The physics were straightforward, textbook standard, and completely inapplicable to a gas-filled biological pressure vessel. Thornton consulted with the U.S. Navy's Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit based at the Naval Air Station in nearby North Bend. The conversation, reconstructed from later interviews, reveals the critical miscommunication that sealed the operation's fate. Thornton asked about using dynamite to break up a large object on a beach. The Navy specialists, assuming he meant unexploded ordnance or concrete debris, recommended 20 to 50 pounds as more than sufficient for most scenarios. They cautioned that overblasting could create dangerous shrapnel and advised starting with conservative amounts, increasing if needed. What they didn't know, and what Thornton apparently didn't clarify, was that the large object was a decomposing whale with internal gas pressure approaching explosive levels on its own. The dynamite itself came from Highway Division stockpiles, standard 40% dynamite sticks typically used for road construction. Each stick contained roughly 1/2 pound of explosive material. Thornton's initial calculation called for 100 sticks, 50 pounds total, placed strategically around the whale's base to maximize fragmentation while directing force downward and seaward, away from spectators and town. This figure aligned with Navy recommendations and seemed conservative by highway demolition standards. But then the second-guessing began. What if 50 pounds wasn't enough? What if the blast only partially destroyed the whale, leaving an even more problematic mess? What if they had to conduct a second detonation, doubling costs, extending media coverage of the town's embarrassment, and confirming incompetence? Thornton revised upward, 200 sticks, 100 pounds, then 400 sticks. Then, in what he would later describe as being absolutely certain we had enough, he settled on the final figure, 1,000 sticks of dynamite, half a ton of high explosives deployed against a creature that had evolved over millions of years to be buoyant, flexible, and structurally unlike anything Thornton had ever blown up before. The escalation reveals cognitive bias at work. In psychology, this pattern is called solution amplification. When facing uncertainty, people increase intervention magnitude, assuming more force guarantees success. Thornton had no feedback mechanism to test his calculations. No one had blown up a whale before under documented conditions. He was flying blind, but flying with absolute confidence. And that confidence demanded overwhelming force. If some dynamite was good, more dynamite was better. If more was better, much more was best. The final explosive configuration: 1,000 sticks of 40% dynamite, totaling 1,000 pounds of explosive force. Estimated blast radius based on military demolition charts, 600 feet. Actual spectator distance, 1,500 feet. Number of warning signs posted, 8. Estimated whale internal gas pressure, unknown. No instruments existed to measure it. Estimated force required to fragment 8-ton organic mass. Thornton's calculations suggested 800 pounds. Demolition experts interviewed later suggested 25 pounds would have been excessive. Margin of error: approximately 4,000%. Media coverage compounded the pressure to succeed. Katu, a Portland television station, dispatched reporter Paul Linman and cameraman Doug Brazil to document what they assumed would be a quirky human interest story. Small town solves big problem with American ingenuity and explosives. Their presence, along with print journalists from the Eugene Register Guard and several regional papers, transformed a local crisis management attempt into a performance. November 12, 1970, dawned gray and cold, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning where fog obscures the horizon and sound carries strangely across wet sand. The Highway Division crew arrived at South Beach at 7 a.m. Trucks loaded with equipment, explosives, and the resigned determination of workers who knew they were part of something either brilliant or catastrophic. George Thornton supervised personally, clipboard in hand, reviewing the placement strategy he'd refined over several sleepless nights. The whale, now 5 days dead, had swollen grotesquely overnight. Gases produced by internal decomposition had inflated the carcass to dimensions that strained the skin, visible taut and glistening with seepage. It looked less like a whale and more like a biological bomb counting down to spontaneous detonation. The explosive placement followed military demolition patterns adapted for unusual circumstances. Workers arranged 20 cases of dynamite, each containing 50 sticks, in a horseshoe configuration around the whale's seaward side. The logic held that blast force would push debris toward the ocean, away from spectators gathered on the landward side behind established safety perimeters. Additional charges were placed beneath the carcass, intended to lift and fragment the mass in an upward trajectory that would then collapse into manageable pieces. What the workers noticed immediately, and what photographic evidence preserves, is how deeply they had to dig to position charges beneath the whale. The carcass had settled into the sand, creating a suction seal that made the underneath positioning problematic. In several locations, workers couldn't reach the planned depth, so they improvised, placing dynamite in shallow depressions and hoping blast force would compensate for imperfect positioning. This deviation from Thornton's schematic would later prove significant, though no one recognized it at the time. The detonation system used simple electrical firing, common in highway construction. Orange cables ran from each explosive cluster to a central detonator box positioned 300 feet away, beyond the estimated danger zone. Thornton triple-checked every connection, testing continuity with a multimeter, ensuring no breaks that might cause partial detonation. A partial blast, leaving some dynamite unexploded, would create an even worse scenario, requiring manual recovery of live explosives from a partially destroyed whale carcass. Everything had to fire simultaneously. Everything had to work. By noon, the beach had transformed into an impromptu festival. Cars lined Highway 101 for 2 miles in both directions. Families set up lawn chairs. Vendors sold coffee and donuts. Children built sandcastles at what parents confidently believed was a safe distance. The crowd numbered between 500 and 1,000 people, depending on which news report you trust, all drawn by morbid curiosity and the promise of spectacular destruction. This was 1970, before viral videos, before instant replay, before you could witness explosions from the safety of a screen. If you wanted to see a whale explode, you had to be there in person. Catu's cameraman, Doug Brazil, selected his vantage point with professional calculation. He positioned himself approximately quarter-mile from the blast site, camera on tripod, telephoto lens attached. This distance would provide dramatic footage while maintaining safety, or so the calculations suggested. Reporter Paul Linman prepared his on-camera segments, scripting transitions between Thornton's official statements and the upcoming detonation. The footage they were about to capture would become the most viewed clip in Oregon television history, and would define both their careers in ways neither anticipated. Final explosive inventory: 20 cases, 1,000 sticks, 500 pounds of active dynamite, 40% nitroglycerin composition. Total detonation cord, 800 feet. Number of individual blast points, 23. Estimated combined explosive force, equivalent to 800 pounds of TNT. For reference, the Oklahoma City bombing used 4,800 pounds. The Portland Hotel implosion in 1963 used 750 pounds, but demolished a 15-story building. The whale weighed 16,000 pounds. Force-to-mass ratio: 1 pound explosive per 20 pounds of whale. Standard demolition calculations suggested 1 pound per 500 pounds of material for fragmentation. Overkill factor: approximately 25-fold excess. The silence that followed the blast lasted perhaps 5 seconds. The time it took for the farthest fragments to complete their trajectories and impact the Earth with wet, sickening thuds. Then came the screaming. Not panic screams, those had already peaked during the initial bombardment, but the anguished cries of people discovering they'd been hit by whale debris. The biological shrapnel had splattered across dozens of spectators, coating clothes, hair, and in several unfortunate cases, open mouths of people who'd been shouting in excitement when the blast occurred. The smell alone induced vomiting. The texture, later described by victims with barely suppressed trauma as warm cottage cheese mixed with motor oil, made the experience even worse. Those covered in blubber tried desperately to scrape it off, but whale fat has remarkable adhesive properties, especially when combined with partially decomposed tissue fluids. Walter Umenhofer approached his destroyed Oldsmobile in a daze. The massive chunk that had obliterated his vehicle's roof had partially liquefied on impact, coating the entire car in a thick layer of putrefying whale blubber. The interior was destroyed, seats, dashboard, all ruined beyond any hope of cleaning. Insurance adjuster photographs taken 2 days later show a vehicle that appeared to have been attacked by a biological weapon, which, in a sense, it had been. The insurance company's initial claim denial cited policy language excluding falling objects resulting from governmental operations, a clause presumably intended for highway construction debris, not airborne cetacean matter. The beach itself resembled a catastrophe zone. The main whale carcass, still approximately 13,000 pounds despite the explosion, lay in a crater surrounded by blast-displaced sand. Smaller craters marked where 100-pound chunks had impacted. A debris trail extended northwest, following wind patterns and ballistic trajectories, with pieces ranging from fist-sized to refrigerator-sized scattered across an 800-foot radius. Seagulls, initially scared away by the explosion, returned within minutes and began feeding with frenzied enthusiasm. What Thornton had hoped nature would clean up discreetly was instead becoming a seagull buffet witnessed by hundreds of traumatized spectators. Highway division workers, who'd observed from the presumed safety zone, now faced the grim reality of cleanup. Their trucks approached cautiously, crews armed with shovels, tarps, and industrial-strength garbage bags. The work was horrific, gathering decomposed whale tissue by hand, loading it into trucks, trying not to vomit while doing so. Several workers simply refused, citing health concerns or overwhelming disgust. Those who persevered described it as the worst job of their careers, worse than highway accident cleanups, worse than anything their training had prepared them for. The pieces were slippery, malodorous, and disturbingly warm from the explosion's heat. Loading them into trucks required teamwork, strong stomachs, and frequent breaks for dry heaving. Cleanup metrics paint the disaster's scope. Estimated cleanup time originally projected by Thornton, 4 hours. Actual cleanup time, 3 days. Number of highway workers involved, 22. Number who requested reassignment after day 1, 14. Volume of debris collected, 47 industrial-sized truckloads. Final disposal method, burial in a landfill 37 miles inland. Estimated cleanup cost, $6,400. Umenhofer's car replacement cost, $3,200. Total incident cost, approximately $10,000, equivalent to $76,000 in 2024. Cost of conventional professional whale removal, estimated $8,000. Thornton's projected savings, minus $2,000. Media coverage intensified as word spread. Katu's evening news broadcast on November 12th featured Paul Linman's report prominently, complete with Doug Brazil's spectacular footage. Portland viewers watched in horror and fascination as their television screens showed a massive explosion, airborne whale chunks, and Thornton's devastated face delivering his masterpiece of understatement. The story got picked up by wire services, Associated Press, United Press International, and by November 13th, newspapers across America were running headlines like "Whale Blast Backfires," "Oregon's Explosive Mistake," and "Beached Whale Removal Goes Horribly Wrong." Doug Brazil's footage possessed an almost eerie quality, the kind of historical documentation that seems too perfect, too comprehensive to be accidental. His camera had captured everything: the pre-blast preparations, Thornton's confident demeanor, the gathered crowd's anticipation, the explosion's initial bloom, the horrifying emergence of massive debris from the cloud, the panicked scatter of spectators, and the aftermath's stunned silence. More importantly, he'd maintained professional composure throughout, keeping the camera steady and properly framed even as objects weighing hundreds of pounds tumbled through the air in his general vicinity. That footage became not just a news story, but a historical artifact, the definitive visual record of one of history's most spectacular municipal failures. Paul Linman's reporting complemented the visuals perfectly. His script balanced factual reporting with subtle comedy, allowing the incident's inherent absurdity to speak for itself without excessive editorializing. His on-camera delivery managed to convey sympathy for the difficult situation while acknowledging the spectacular nature of the failure. The combination of Brazil's cinematography and Linman's narration created a news package that transcended typical local coverage, becoming something closer to documentary film, a complete narrative arc compressed into 4 minutes of television. K2 aired the segment on their November 12th evening news broadcast, leading the program with what they correctly identified as an extraordinary story. Portland area viewers watched in real time as their state became nationally famous for explosive whale disposal gone catastrophically wrong. Phone lines at the station lit up immediately. Some callers outraged at the waste of taxpayer money, others simply wanting to know if the footage was real. Many asking for confirmation that no one had been seriously injured. The stories spread through traditional media followed predictable 1970s patterns. Wire services picked it up. Newspapers ran it with Brazil's still photographs. Radio stations described it in vivid detail. By November 14th, the incident had achieved national awareness, mentioned in news broadcasts from New York to Los Angeles. The Seattle Times ran it on the front page with the headline, "Whale of a Mistake, Oregon Blast Backfires." The San Francisco Chronicle's coverage included expert commentary from marine biologists confirming that yes, this was as foolish as it appeared, and no one with relevant expertise would have recommended this approach. But 1970s media had limitations. Television news didn't preserve indefinitely. Footage aired, then disappeared into network archives, accessible only to professionals with access to physical tape libraries. Newspapers yellowed and were discarded. Within months, the exploding whale existed primarily in memory, vivid for those who'd witnessed it directly or seen the original broadcast, but fading for the broader culture. By 1975, it was an Oregon regional story. By 1980, even locals rarely mentioned it. The incident seemed destined for historical obscurity, remembered only by those directly involved, and occasional references in engineering textbooks as a cautionary example. George Thornton likely appreciated this gradual fade. While the immediate aftermath had been professionally humiliating, time's passage allowed the incident to recede, his reputation to partially recover. He continued his career, avoided interviews about the whale, and probably hoped the story would eventually die completely, as dead as the whale should have been after proper disposal. But the footage survived in Katu's archives, a time capsule waiting for the perfect moment to detonate, with force rivaling the original explosion. That moment arrived in 1990, when a producer at the station going through old tape rediscovered Brazil's footage and recognized its potential. The videotape quality had degraded slightly, colors faded, lines appearing occasionally, but the content remained spectacular. The producer convinced station management to re-air the segment during a slow news period, framing it as vintage news and nostalgia programming. The scientific community's response to the exploding whale incident evolved from immediate frustration to long-term fascination with what it revealed about human decision-making, ecological processes, and the spectacular gap between theory and practice. Dr. Bruce Mate, who'd warned against the explosive approach before it happened, watched the aftermath with professional dismay and personal vindication. The fundamental problem, he explained in a 1971 interview for a marine biology journal, is that people treated an organic system like an engineering problem. Whales aren't rocks. Their tissue has evolved over millions of years to be flexible, resilient, and self-regulating when alive. In death, those same properties create completely different challenges than inorganic materials present. The marine biology perspective on whale carcass disposal emphasizes understanding decomposition processes and working with natural systems rather than against them. When a whale dies at sea, its body goes through predictable stages: initial sinking, if not buoyant from decomposition gases, gradual breakdown by deep-sea scavengers, and eventual skeletal dispersal across the ocean floor. These whale falls create temporary ecosystems, supporting unique species that depend on the massive nutrient input. The process is ecologically valuable, not merely disposal. It's nutrient cycling on a spectacular scale. Beached whales, however, present different challenges. Removed from their natural disposal system, they become public health concerns and logistical nightmares. Modern marine mammal response protocols, developed partially in reaction to disasters like Florence's, emphasize several evidence-based approaches. First, assessment and documentation. Teams examine the carcass to determine species, approximate age, and possible cause of death. Tissue samples are collected for research. Marine mammal deaths often provide valuable data about ocean health, pollution levels, and population dynamics. This work must occur quickly before decomposition compromises sample quality, creating time pressure that can lead to hasty subsequent decisions. Second, consideration of natural processes. If the whale beached in a remote location where public health concerns are minimal, the best option may be doing nothing. Letting nature decompose the carcass through scavenger activity and microbial breakdown. This approach, while slow, taking months to years, requires no intervention, carries no risk of catastrophic failure, and provides ecological benefits to the local scavenger population. Third, if intervention is necessary, proven methods exist. Burial at sea involves towing the carcass to deep water and weighting it to ensure sinking, essentially artificially creating a whale fall. This requires specialized equipment and careful calculation to prevent the carcass from washing ashore elsewhere. On-site burial is viable for beaches where deep excavation won't encounter groundwater. The grave must be deep enough to prevent scavengers from excavating it and positioned above high tide lines to prevent tidal exposure. Modern equipment can dig appropriate graves in hours, making this often the most practical solution. Fourth, and most complex, is flensing. the systematic dismemberment and removal of the carcass in manageable pieces. This approach, borrowed from historical whaling practices, involves skilled workers with specialized tools cutting the whale into sections small enough for transport. It's labor-intensive, requires specific expertise, and exposes workers to considerable health risks from pathogens and decomposition gases. But when done properly by trained professionals, it's completely effective and avoids the risks of explosive solutions. Scientific data on whale decomposition: average time for complete natural decomposition in marine environment, 5 to 30 years, depending on depth and scavenger activity. Decomposition rate on land, 2 to 5 years in temperate climate. Number of documented beached whale incidents globally per year, current, approximately 2,000. Percentage successfully resolved without major incident using modern protocols, 96%. Number of documented explosive whale disposal attempts globally, 3. Norway, 1970. Oregon, 1970. Taiwan, 2004. Success rate of explosive disposal, 0%. Amount of dynamite recommended by modern whale disposal experts, 0 pounds. What happened in Taiwan in 2004 provided a horrifying counterpoint to Florence's lesson. A dead sperm whale being transported through the city of Tainan on a flatbed truck to a research facility spontaneously exploded from internal gas buildup. No explosives were involved. The decomposition gases simply exceeded the structural integrity of the distended skin, and the whale ruptured violently in the middle of a city street. Blood, organs, and tissue sprayed across buildings, vehicles, and unfortunate pedestrians. The incident, captured on video and widely circulated online, demonstrated that whales are biological pressure vessels capable of explosive failure without any human-added detonation. This natural explosion phenomenon validates marine biologists' concerns about Thornton's approach. The Florence whale already had internal pressure approaching explosive levels. Adding half a ton of dynamite didn't just fragment the tissue, it triggered a combination of chemical explosion and biological rupture that amplified the destructive force beyond what either component would have produced independently. The whale's internal gases essentially supercharged the blast, explaining why debris traveled far beyond calculated ranges and why the carcass launched upward rather than fragmenting in place. Modern decomposition science also explains why Thornton's assumptions about scavenger cleanup were flawed. While seagulls, crabs, and other scavengers will indeed consume whale tissue, they prefer smaller pieces they can handle safely. 100-pound chunks are too large for most scavengers to process efficiently. The pieces would have required weeks or months to break down naturally, during which they'd continue decomposing, generating smell, and creating ongoing public health concerns. Thornton's plan essentially transformed one concentrated problem into dozens of distributed problems that would persist longer than the original carcass would have. The scientific consensus now firmly opposes explosive whale disposal. Engineering organizations include the Florence incident in case studies about the dangers of applying solutions outside their intended domain. Environmental management textbooks cite it as an example of failing to consult relevant experts, and marine biology programs use it to illustrate the importance of understanding biological systems before attempting intervention. 54 years after the explosion, the lessons of Florence's failed whale disposal have achieved something rare: universal acknowledgement of spectacular failure as valuable wisdom. The incident appears in engineering ethics courses worldwide, not as a mockery of incompetence, but as a case study in overconfidence, inadequate consultation, and the dangers of applying familiar solutions to unfamiliar problems. George Thornton wasn't stupid. He was experienced, educated, and trying to solve a genuine problem with tools he understood. His failure teaches more than success ever could. That expertise has boundaries. Those boundaries matter, and crossing them confidently doesn't reduce the risks, it amplifies them. Modern whale disposal protocols explicitly reference fluorines in their development history. The Marine Mammal Protection Act, strengthened in the decades after 1970, includes specific provisions for stranding response that emphasize scientific consultation and proven methods. Professional response teams now exist along most coastal areas, trained specifically in whale carcass handling. They use the tools Thornton should have: heavy equipment for burial, specialized vessels for deep-sea disposal, or flensing expertise for dismemberment. Not once in their protocols does the word dynamite appear except in sections titled Methods to Avoid. The exploding whale has achieved rare status. It's simultaneously a cautionary tale and a source of genuine affection. People love the story not because Thornton failed, but because the failure was so spectacularly, perfectly catastrophic that it transcended mere mistake and became art. The arc from confidence to explosion to aftermath follows narrative patterns that satisfy something deep in human psychology: the recognition that our plans, no matter how carefully constructed, can encounter reality with explosive consequences. Oregon itself has embraced the incident's legacy with remarkable grace. The Oregon Historical Society maintains an exhibit featuring the original footage, newspaper clippings, and interviews with survivors. Florence's Visitor Center includes information about the incident, acknowledging it honestly rather than hiding from the embarrassment. The state's official tourism materials even reference it obliquely, with taglines like "Oregon, where nature always wins," that locals recognize as whale explosion humor. The ability to laugh at spectacular failure while learning from it represents cultural maturity that many communities never achieve. Legacy metrics, measuring the incident's impact. Number of academic papers referencing it, 47. Engineering programs using it as a case study, estimated 200 plus. Documented beached whale incidents since 1970, resolved with explosives, 0. Lives saved by proper disposal protocols developed afterward, incalculable. Economic cost of modern professional whale removal, $15,000 to $40,000. Success rate, 99% plus. Number of crushed cars in modern removals, 0. Number of internet references, parodies, and mentions, impossible to count, but certainly in the hundreds of thousands. Walter Umenhofer, the crushed car owner, eventually received insurance compensation after legal pressure and media attention made denial untenable. His Oldsmobile's destruction became the incident's perfect symbol. Physical evidence that good intentions could rain destruction on innocent bystanders more than quarter-mile from the intended impact zone. Umenhofer gave occasional interviews about the experience, always with good humor, noting that being part of history's most famous whale explosion provided better stories than his destroyed car had cost him. Paul Lindman's reporting won multiple journalism awards, not in 1970 but retroactively, as organizations recognized the exceptional documentary value of his work. His professional balance between conveying the disaster's seriousness and allowing its inherent comedy to emerge naturally set standards for reporting on government failures. "I didn't editorialize," he explained in a 2015 interview. "I just showed what happened and let George Thornton explain it himself. The story didn't need embellishment. Reality was already absurd enough." The participants have mostly passed away now. George Thornton died in 1995. having spent his later years avoiding the subject but occasionally acknowledging, in private moments, that he'd learned more from that failure than from any of his successes. Doug Brazil continued his cinematography career, his whale explosion footage remaining his most viewed work, despite decades of other professional achievements. The last known eyewitness to the explosion still living is 73 years old as of 2024 and occasionally appears at historical society events, describing the experience with vivid detail undimmed by decades.